is Connor. I'm a first-year PhD student at Ulster University here in Northern Ireland. And as Lee's already said, I've got 10 minutes with you today to discuss my research entitled The Disabled Supporter as an Activist for Social Inclusion in the English Football League. The format of this presentation will follow that of a sort of a PhD proposal, as I don't have any empirical data to share with you today, but any constructive feedback or anything like that would be obviously welcomed. So I'm going to take you through the introduction, background, research, aims and questions, methodology, and then finally why this research is important. So fundamentally then, this research is interested in exploring the lived experiences of supporters with physical impairments who make use of accessible seating areas when attending football matches in the English Football League. And the English Football League, in this case, obviously refers to the EFL Championship, League One and League Two. The context for this study will become a little bit more apparent as we go through the presentation. Now, the research is underpinned by a social relational understanding of disability, which frames disability as a form of social oppression caused by the social relationships people categorized as impaired have with material barriers and non-disabled people. This model and this understanding of disability is able to capture the agency of people with impairments while understanding the structural forces that restrict their lives. And through this lens, then, disability is understood to be biosocial in nature. And it suggests that an individual's impairment, social, environmental, and psychological barriers can operate simultaneously. And this social relational model provides us with multiple avenues in which to explore the experiences of disabled people in sports settings. This understanding of disability and why it's important will become a little bit more clearer as we go through the presentation, particularly in my research questions. So to provide a little bit more background to the research, research in various sporting contexts, which typically involve disabled people playing rather than spectating sport, has found that disabled people face a number of difficulties and barriers to sport and leisure participation, ranging from ableist attitudes to inaccessible facilities. But despite this research and the broader research that's been undertaken within the study of football fandom and fan cultures in the United Kingdom, little empirical research has given any attention to the lived experiences of those disabled people who spectate football rather than play it. And more to the point, football fans encounter when intending to spectate football, and in turn how they seek to negotiate these barriers. And I find this concerning, considering that the majority of interaction between disabled people and football is achieved through spectatorship rather than playing. And I think it's about time that research in football studies acknowledges the presence of disabled fans in their stadiums and works towards improving some of their experiences. Now, under the Equality Act 2010, English football clubs at all levels are required to make reasonable adjustments to facilitate the inclusion of disabled spectators in their stadiums. Although this term, reasonable adjustments, is interpreted differently across clubs, which often leads to inconsistent provision for disabled fans, particularly those who travel away with their clubs. Now, the policies that underpin the way football clubs engage with their fans, and disabled fans more specifically, is underpinned and heavily influenced by a social model, or a strong social model of disability. And this model of disability is vastly influential, and it is, again, a vastly influential ideology that frames disability as something caused exclusively by social barriers, such as inaccessible buildings, rather than suggesting it's the individual's impairment that causes disability. But because the social model understanding is embedded within football policy, clubs primarily understand inclusion and access in terms of the removal of physical barriers through the adjustment of club infrastructure. And as with this social model, this stance on access can certainly be criticised. For example, the fact that football clubs primarily understand access in terms of removal of physical barriers fails to acknowledge the multidimensional nature of the concept of access. And what I mean by this is that access for disabled people requires far more than just physical or environmental adjustments. Rather, access incorporates components of knowledge, of power and advocacy, and also creating opportunities for disabled people to create social relationships within a given context. Now, Linden Seald's multidimensional model of access helps us to think about the different concepts associated with the term. And this can be used within my research, or I'm hoping to use it in my research going forward, to better understand access within a footballing context for disabled fans. Now, despite the improvements to physical access in stadiums in recent years, particularly with new stadiums being built, a study by Garcia et al. In 2017, which is the only study to focus on the lived experiences of disabled fans in England, came to the conclusion that actually football clubs in England are not becoming more inclusive for these disabled fans in the sense of facilitating greater participation and expanding the networks of disabled people. And this raises some questions around clubs' commitments to providing disabled fans with accessible and inclusive spectator environments, as many fans still encounter negative matchday experiences, such as the one at the Vitality Stadium in Bournemouth back in December. I know this is not the EFL, it's rather in the Premiership, but I suggest people go away and actually have a look at that just to kind of get a feel for some of the barriers that disabled fans encounter quite regularly. So in many cases then, it's the involvement of advocacy organisations such as Level Playing Field, disabled supporter associations, which are club-specific fan groups for disabled fans, and also individual fans that seek to develop positive relationships with their clubs in order to negotiate improved levels of access and also inclusion for disabled fans. Now, the active negotiations that occur between these actors are often centred around social change that occur in football, such as those that relate to the improved physical access of stadiums, like I've already mentioned, as well as through football, which relate to broader debates about the rights of disabled people in sport and leisure settings. And this can be understood as a form of activism. Although little is known about these processes of negotiation and how disabled fans collectively mobilise to obtain these more inclusive spectator environments. And furthermore, then, little is also known about how disabled people enact forms of resistance to oppose disabling discourses that may operate within football at micro levels. And to explore this, I intend to use the concept of everyday resistance that refers to the everyday, often covert, verbal, cognitive, and physical acts that undermine power. In this case, power refers to disabling discourses and ableist assumptions that permeate society and therefore find their way into English football. So on to the research aims and questions so far. Through this social relational lens of disability that I spoke about at the beginning, the primary aim is to investigate how football supporters with physical impairments negotiate levels of access throughout the English Football League. And at the moment, we have three main research questions that I've been developing. So the first of which are, what are the social, environmental, and psychological barriers disabled spectators encounter, both at the stadium and in preparation to travel to and from the event when intending to spectate football? Secondly, in what ways do disabled football fans enact forms of everyday resistance to oppose disabling discourses in the context of English football? And lastly, how do disabled spectators collectively mobilise and engage in activism to negotiate access and obtain more inclusive spectator environments? So to briefly touch upon the methodology for the study, as I've obviously been speaking about lived experiences of disabled fans, a qualitative design was deemed appropriate for this study. The study will consist of a multi-sited ethnography that will take place at several different football clubs in the EFL. These clubs have yet to be sampled, but we're working on that at the moment. The study will use participant observations and semi-structured interviews to collect data. And for the observations, I intend to document and follow the journeys of disabled fans at various match days, while using the semi-structured interviews to provide further insights and clarifications on some of the themes that may emerge. The study will look to explore key themes around access, agency, activism, ableism, and disablism. And the proposed sampling strategy will be used to identify the suitable participants that are members of the 23 disabled supporter associations in the EFL and who meet the inclusion criteria that is currently being developed. Now, the initial plan was to conduct this ethnography throughout the 2020-2021 season, starting this year in August and going through to May. Although currently that looks like it's going to be unlikely. So I'm hoping now to condense it into January to May. Again, however, we don't know whether fans will actually be allowed back to stadiums next season. So once further details are released, we can kind of shape the methodology towards the current state of play. Although at the moment, as you can tell, the methodology is slightly up in the air and might need some reconsideration in the future. So very lastly then, to finish off, why is this research important? So very little is known about the provision that disabled fans require and how and what disabled spectators and their allies do to challenge football clubs and their governing authorities' stances on access and inclusion for disabled fans. And furthermore, the English Football League context is important because existing work conducted within sport management scholarship, particularly around the accessibility of football stadiums, has focused on Europe's elite clubs and doesn't pay, or hasn't so far paid any attention to clubs lower down the leagues. And obviously these fans require consideration also. Secondly, and while obviously this research will not be able to achieve this alone, it's important to understand the challenges that disabled fans face in order to inform policies of inclusion. And I hope that this research will encourage other researchers and scholars within football studies and also disability studies to work with disabled people in footballing context to improve their experiences, as I mentioned earlier, that many still unfortunately report negative ones. And very lastly then, this research intends to bring together work within disability studies, sport management scholarship, and the sociology of football to start to fill some empirical and theoretical gaps in the literature that relate to the experiences of disabled people who spectate football rather than play it. So thank you very much for listening. That is all from me, and any questions, please fire them my way. Thank you.
Thank you, Connor. Right on.